Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time George Pickett was stationed in the Washington Territory and had a son by a Native American woman, but left the child with a family in Washington. Now he heads back to Virginia. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you've not done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Just like when his first wife passed away, George took leave from the Army. He traveled to Virginia and New York City. On July 21, 1858, he wrote to the War Department requesting a 6-month extension to his leave, which was granted. At the end of 1858 and the beginning of 1859, Pickett returned to Fort Bellingham in the Washington Territory. The area was still contested between the United States and Great Britain, and when the territory was created, it didn't clearly establish the boundary between the two nations, and San Juan Island was one of those contested areas. In July 1859, Pickett was ordered to build a post on the San Juan Island. The British Hudson Bay Company allowed their hogs to run freely all over the island. In June, an American named Lyman Cutler found one of those hogs rooting through his tater patch and chased the animal and eventually shot it dead. The pig's owner, Charles Griffin, refused the money Cutler offered to pay for the pig. The refusal allegedly came after Cutler claimed he had rather shoot the owner than the pig. Griffin wanted Cutler prosecuted by the British government, but Cutler claimed the animal hadn't been killed on British soil. The now famous Pig War had begun. When Pickett's commander in the Department of Oregon ordered him to build a post on San Juan Island, it was to safeguard American settlers as well as secure the interests of the United States on the island. The commander also gave Pickett essentially independent command of the area. Pickett jumped at the chance to gain recognition. He quickly got to the island and issued a proclamation stating, "This being United States territory, no laws other than those of the United States, nor courts except such as are held by virtue of said laws, will be recognized or allowed on this island." Pickett was immediately confronted by the British, and a British war steamer came very close to the island in preparation for hostilities. Pickett defiantly told the British that he was ordered there by the U.S. government, and only an order from them would send him away. However, the confidence was most likely a show. As time ticked away, Pickett got more worried. He wrote to his commander's adjutant, Alfred Pleasonton, "You know I am a peaceable man, but we cannot stand everything." As the small American force was being surrounded, Pickett agreed to a meeting between the belligerents to discuss peace negotiations. The British offered a fair resolution that the two nations would occupy the island until civilian authorities could settle the issue. Pickett refused that offer. Soon more troops were brought to the island from the American side, numbering about 450 men. With the influx of troops came officers, and Pickett no longer was the commander of the post. The British weren't looking to escalate the tensions. Napoleon III's campaign in Italy threatened European stability, and the last thing Britain wanted was a war with the United States. When President James Buchanan heard about the tensions, he was astonished. He immediately sent word to the British government that the commander of the department had acted without his knowledge, and proposed a way to settle the matter. Buchanan also dispatched Winfield Scott to the territory to assess the damage. He arrived on October 20, 1859, with the intention of keeping the peace. Scott agreed to the joint occupation of the island, and Pickett was sent back to Fort Bellingham. By the spring of 1860, with Scott gone, the departmental commander ignored Scott's orders for a joint occupation and ordered Pickett back to the island. Scott finally removed the departmental commander, which cooled tensions. Pickett acted as a sort of constable, maintaining order on San Juan Island. When a white man killed an Indian outside of a brothel, Pickett got restitution paid to the Indian family and put into rest any threat of an avenging raid by the Indian's family. With the election of Abraham Lincoln at the end of 1860, Pickett, as well as other Army officers, had a decision to make: side with the Union or the Confederacy. Pickett wrote to another Army officer that, "I myself come from a Union-loving state," but he argued that Virginia and other outer border states cannot make their voices heard. He condemned the Republicans who, in their pride and flush of victory, will not listen to the terms proposed by the conservative element from those good and true states. However, he was equally critical of the fire eaters. I do not like to be bullied or dragged out of the Union by the precipitatory and indecent haste of South Carolina. In June 1861, Pickett received orders to report to California to possibly put down a Confederate outbreak in that state. Virginia had already seceded, but when he was ordered to California, he decided to resign from the Army. The fact that he waited so long may indicate that he was satisfied remaining in his adopted territory of Washington, but when he found he was going to have to fight against a possible Confederate threat in California, that may have convinced him to join his birth state. Pickett's son James was left in the care of the Collins family and his son's namesake, James Tilton. Pickett gave Tilton $100 for being so kind to look after his son. Pickett didn't even say goodbye to his son before he left. He did leave his son a Bible and his Army papers so the little boy would know who his father was, but when Pickett left the Washington Territory, his child would never see him again. Pickett's future wife claimed in her post-war writings that Pickett was followed by government agents when he resigned and had to wear disguises and travel with a companion to elude the federal authorities. She also claimed he re-entered the country through New York City and traveled through the Midwestern states into Kentucky, then Tennessee, and on to Richmond, Virginia. Plenty of Army officers left the U.S. Army without being followed in such a way, so her claims are probably fabricated. He got to Richmond in September 1861 and offered his services to the Confederacy. Within the span of about a week, Pickett was given the rank of major in the artillery, then captain in the infantry, and finally a promotion to colonel and the responsibility of commanding the lower Rappahannock River. While the main Confederate army in Virginia sat north of his position, Pickett guarded the lower end of the Rappahannock River. A few scares and reports of Union gunboats approaching his position came in, but those turned out to be false. The scariest moment for Pickett was when he realized that the locals and some of the troops placed under his command were likely to side with the Union, as Unionist sympathy pervaded parts of the area he commanded. A greater portion of our loyal men, the chivalry and high-toned gentlemen of the country, have volunteered and are far from their homes. There is a strong element among those who are left either to be non-combatants or to fall back under the old flag. I cannot close this communication to the General Commandant without saying that many more complaints were made by a certain class of population than are warranted. We have to fear them most. All during a war like this must suffer, but for the good of the general service, it will not do to yield to those persons who have refused to volunteer, while the proprietors of the country are actually in the field, and who plead poverty and would join the enemy should an occasion occur. It will be a mistaken leniency and would only lead to further trouble. The Confederate War Department finally sent a regiment of Virginians under Colonel John M. Brockenbrough to Pickett, after Pickett personally went to Richmond to find out what was holding up the reinforcements. However, there was a problem. Brockenbrough was senior to Pickett, outranking him and basically making Pickett's presence void. Amazingly, Pickett was removed from his position along the Rappahannock and promoted to brigadier general in February 1862. Pickett may have simply benefited from being at the right place at the right time. He was an unattached colonel with formal military education and real, if limited, combat experience. Johnston's main army at Centerville suffered from chronic shortages of general officers to command brigades, one of which was composed entirely of Virginia troops. President Davis normally insisted that brigadier generals be from the same state as the men. Pickett's visit to Richmond may have brought his name to the forefront and highlighted his availability at the most opportune time. By February 28th, Pickett joined Joseph E. Johnston's Army of the Potomac around Centerville, commanding a brigade in James Longstreet's division. Pickett and Longstreet had been friends for a long time, and when 3 of Longstreet's children died around this time, it was said that Pickett made the funeral arrangements because Longstreet and his wife Louise were too distraught to do so. Pickett had a short distance to report to Johnston from his position on the Rappahannock, but took him over 10 days to make the journey. One historian believes he was courting LaSalle Corbell, the young lady he had met on a Virginia beach many years ago, following the death of his first wife. Whether that delayed him or not, their courtship began to burn brighter around that time. Pickett was with Johnston's army only about 3 weeks before the army commander decided he needed to withdraw to protect his supply lines. The wet spring made the march south a miserable quagmire for officers and men alike. The first major stop for Pickett was at Culpeper Courthouse. At that location, bits and pieces of Johnston's force were sent to the peninsula formed by the York and James Rivers, where the Union Army of the Potomac was landing. That force under Major General George McClellan planned to march up the peninsula and threaten Richmond, the Confederate capital. Johnston held Longstreet's division back at Culpeper Courthouse. While there, Pickett inspected his troops, and when he came to a young man in line, he took his rifle and ran a white gloved finger over the barrel of the weapon. When Pickett finished rubbing his finger along the barrel, the glove showed a rust streak. The young man's colonel stepped in and said that this young man had come from the North to support the South. Pickett took out a handkerchief, blew his nose, and turned away without saying a word. The young man recalled, "It was a little mortifying to be pointed out as this young man, and stared at without even a nod of recognition, but alas, all the patriotism in the world wouldn't count in the scale of a West Pointer with 1 or 2 degrees of higher rank, however the great equality in all other respects." Soon the threat was too great from the Union Army on the peninsula, and the rest of Johnston's force moved from Culpeper Courthouse to Yorktown. Pickett's men sat in the trenches in that wet spring, with water sometimes standing a foot deep in their fortifications. During the siege of Yorktown, Pickett's men saw their commander's temper firsthand. When some Union soldiers took a redoubt that was lightly manned, Pickett noticed a nearby artillery battery standing around idle, letting the Union have their way with the position. Captain James Deering, commander of Pickett's artillery, recounts the story from there. Pickett is not noted for keeping his temper, so he ripped out with a whole handful of pretty strong words and told them that he ranked Colonel Brown and was in command down here just then, and if they didn't fire they had better leave. Longstreet soon arrived and backed up Pickett's argument. Johnston pulled his army back up the peninsula in the face of McClellan's 100,000 troops. At Williamsburg, to give the supply train ample time to make it to safety, the Confederates turned on their pursuers, with Longstreet's division taking a very active part in the Battle of Williamsburg. Pickett's men fought bravely with their commander by their side. After the battle, Longstreet reported that Pickett, greatly distinguished in other fields, used his forces with great effect, ability, and his usual gallantry. Despite his good performance, Pickett was concerned over the battle. During the engagement, he witnessed a colonel get shot down when he halted his men after seeing a white flag of surrender. I must mention also the dastardly subterfuges of an enemy pretending to surrender in order to stop our fire to allow their reinforcements to come up and enable them to pour in a deadly volley upon an honorable and too unsuspecting foe. The Confederate army kept trudging on toward Richmond, and McClellan pursued. The Union army pushed so close to the capital that they could tell time by the church bells ringing. Unfortunately for the Union army commander, he had essentially split his army in half, with part of it north of the Chickahominy River and the other half south of it. Johnston viewed this as a great opportunity to destroy a good segment of the enemy. During the opening part of the Battle of Seven Pines or Fair Oaks, Pickett's brigade took no part. As the battle was starting to go against the Confederacy, Longstreet sent Pickett forward and put him under command of Daniel Harvey Hill. When Pickett arrived at the front, a Confederate Zouave soldier from Louisiana came rushing into his lines on the back of a mule. Pickett stopped him and asked what the problem was. The Louisianian stated that the enemy was just ahead and he was trying to save his own life. Pickett was disgusted at the actions of the man, but soon a mob of rebel soldiers came bursting through the woods in his front, just like the lone rider before. Hill gave Pickett orders to move forward, and he did, excited at the chance to attack the enemy and drive them away. From Pickett's perspective, his men performed beautifully, pushing aside everything in front of them, but in reality Pickett was entering into somewhat of an inverted V formation in the Union line, and when he entered it, a deadly crossfire began to rip into his ranks. He rode to Hill and asked for help, but Pickett was essentially on his own. But he was stubborn and didn't want to fall back. He stayed at the front for nearly an hour before having to pull back. With the fight at Williamsburg and now Seven Pines, Pickett's reputation within the army was that he was an aggressive and dependable commander. The brigade would gain a nickname as well, the Gamecock Brigade. In the fight at Seven Pines, Joseph E. Johnston was seriously wounded. Robert E. Lee would assume command of the army and name it the Army of Northern Virginia, the name it would carry to the end of the war. For about a month, Lee prepared his army for a series of attacks to drive McClellan back down the peninsula. Those attacks would be known as the 7 Days Battles. For the first day, Pickett's brigade was held back and didn't engage, but at Gaines' Mill, Pickett threw his men into the fight amidst a terrible storm of musketry and artillery. In one of the attacks, a staff officer noticed Pickett fall from his horse. I did not perceive his fall until he said to me in very expressive terms that somebody had hit him. I immediately dismounted, examined his wound, and found the hole of a minie ball in his shoulder. In her post-war writings, Sally Corbell, Pickett's wife, would write of him heroically, telling a surgeon to take the ball out of his shoulder right there, and telling the doctor that he must go to the front to help his brigade. Major John Cheeves Haskell wrote that he passed by Pickett, who was standing by his horse in a deep small hollow, almost like a well, bewailing himself. He called to me to send a litter as he was mortally wounded. I had none and was too busy with my men. He was very slightly wounded and perfectly able to take care of himself. The wound incapacitated Pickett enough that he stayed in Richmond, cared for by Sally, while the Army of Northern Virginia fought at the Second Battle of Manassas and Antietam. Upon the Army's return to Virginia, following its first invasion of the North, Lee reorganized the Army. With this reorganization, there came a demand for brigade and division commanders. On November 6, 1862, Pickett was promoted to Major General. As in the past, a combination of personal connections, good fortune, and circumstances seemed again to push Pickett's military career forward. In reality, he lacked demonstrated experience to warrant such a promotion. Pickett had little time to savor his promotion. After 4 idle months, he commanded 15,000 battle-worn veterans. By December, Pickett found himself again on the banks of the Rappahannock River, but instead of being a colonel, he was now Major General. The Union Army of the Potomac now confronted the Army of Northern Virginia outside of the town of Fredericksburg, Virginia. In this enormous battle, Pickett and his men were little more than spectators, watching the repetitive blue tide surge against the Confederate works. Both armies began to settle in for a mostly quiet winter, but in February 1863, Lee detached Pickett and his division to the south side of the James River in anticipation of a Union push up the peninsula again. He didn't remain there long before Longstreet arrived to take command of Pickett's division and the other troops in the vicinity and move on Suffolk, Virginia. Moxley Sorrell, Longstreet's assistant adjutant general, recalled Longstreet and Pickett's relationship. Taking Longstreet's orders in emergencies, I could always see how he, Longstreet, looked after Pickett and made us give him things very fully, indeed sometimes stay with him to make sure he did not get astray. Moxley added that Longstreet was exceedingly fond of Pickett. Longstreet moved Pickett and John Bell Hood's divisions to Suffolk to lay siege to help protect Richmond and to gather food to send to Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. Pickett was in close proximity while at Suffolk to the home of Sally. By April, he was on the Confederate right near the Dismal Swamp. He would leave his troops almost every night to visit Sally at Barber's Crossroads, where Sally stayed with her aunt. Longstreet became irritated at the constant request by Pickett to go visit Sally. Pickett saw these irritations in his interactions with the corps commander. So Pickett decided to ask Moxley Sorrell, a member of Longstreet's staff, for permission. Sorrell declined. Pickett begged, but he is tired of it and will refuse, and I must go. I must see her. I swear, Sorrell, I'll be back before anything can happen in the morning. Despite the denial of Sorrell, Pickett went to see Sally without permission. While outside of Suffolk, a cavalry officer was resting on a fence when the fence rail broke, and he came crashing down on a sleeping Pickett, wrapped in an oilcloth. His waking was unceremonious, and cuss words filled the air. Pickett was then about 35 or 36 years old, short and fat with a red face, mustache, and imperial. He was a free liver, but never drank to excess when on duty. Colonel Eppa Hunton, of Pickett's division, remembered, "In riding with Pickett along his lines with his staff, we came to an exposed position, and to my surprise, General Pickett and his staff laid flat down on their horses' necks. Hunton was shocked and angry, and felt this was a poor example for the men in the ranks. The disgusted colonel rode with Pickett bolt upright in my saddle. Hunton claimed that Pickett was a gallant man, but his courtship and eventual marriage to LaSalle Corbell somehow changed him. Up to the time he was married, Hunton maintained, I had the utmost confidence in his gallantry, but I believe that no man who married during the war was as good a soldier after as before marriage." Hunton believed that marriage during the war seemed to demoralize men. Around this same time, the Confederate War Department suggested sending Pickett's division to Braxton Bragg's Army of Tennessee in the volunteer state, then to send him to John C. Pemberton at Vicksburg, Mississippi. Robert E. Lee shut down both of those ideas, preferring to keep Pickett with Longstreet in order to secure food for the Army of Northern Virginia in preparation for the spring and summer campaigns. There's no indication that Pickett knew about those discussions, but he would have been completely satisfied to stay near Suffolk, near his sweetheart Sally.